Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 167 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm thrilled to have Rob Beckman with us on the show. Rob is the host of the Firearm Trainers podcast, and he's dedicated a great deal of time and effort to supporting the firearms industry, advocating for the Second Amendment, and most importantly, empowering firearms instructors across America to elevate their teaching and prepare gun owners for active armed defense. Whether you're in the military, law enforcement, or a civilian enthusiast, Rob's insights from his extensive experience are invaluable. Uh, so I hope you'll tune in as we dive into his insights from his podcast and from the excellent guests that he's had along the way. Learn from some of his lessons and training and from hosting the podcast. I'd consider I'd consider him to be a consistent, reliable, credible, and authoritative voice in the firearms media world and in the firearms training industry. And I think you'll find his insights to be useful, whether you're already a gun owner or whether you're considering becoming a gun owner. So with all that said, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show, Alex.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I've connected, and I was trying to think back to when I first learned about you, and I know it was through Paul Lathrop and the Polite
Mm-hmm.
Society podcast, and I was struggling to remember when that was, but it
That
would
was
have
about
been
3 years ago, and you and me were on the Weekly Bullet
okay.
on a Saturday
Yeah,
for it. I remember that.
that sounds right, and it switched. He was doing it as the daily bullet, and he had the weekly bullet as well, and then he went back to the Polite Society podcast. Um, so I think you're right. It was the weekly bullet where we met. So anyway, I'm glad that we met through Paul. I think he just for those who don't know Paul he's stepped away from podcasting, but he was a consistent voice in the firearms world as well for I don't know how long, nearly a decade, maybe a little
Yeah,
longer.
yeah, almost 10 years.
Yeah, and I'm sure he introduced lots of folks, and not only us. So I know I met quite a few great folks through the Polite Society podcast. But Rob, if you would, just starting out, tell us a little bit about yourself. We're not too far away. I'm in Southern Indiana. You're over there in Ohio, just
Mm-hmm.
near the southeastern Indiana border. Tell us a little bit about what you do for a living, how you got into the firearms training world, and how you started the Firearm Trainers podcast.
Yeah, well, the one thing that kind of shows why I kind of got into podcasting is I'm an IT professional. I work on computers, run projects for a global company. So that's, kind of where the technology, comes very easy to me. On the firearm space, it's probably not quite as easy because I came from a family that wasn't necessarily pro-gun, but they weren't anti-gun, but they weren't necessarily pro-gun at the same time. I got my first experience out on my grandparents' farm, to where they had a loaded shotgun behind the back door in case there were any varmints and different things like that had to be taken care of. And when I was, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, Dad went out and said, "Okay, let's see how you'll shoot a 12 gauge shotgun." Um, Not very well, but got kind of the feeling of it. And then once I went along, just progressed through childhood, I was in the Boy Scouts and went to summer camp and found out that I think it was 25 cents. You could go down to the rifle range and shoot a whole brick of 22s with a lever action, which back in the 70s when I was that young, lever action, all the cowboy movies and things like that, that was the coolest thing in the world. And had a lot of fun with that. And this kind of, stayed very casual with it until I got into my mid 30s, and then decided to take up hunting. And again, my family wasn't a big hunting family or anything else like that, but really jumped in with both feet to hunt. And I do your muzzleloading hunting, your shotgun hunting, your rifle hunting, as well as archery hunting. And I do it in the tri-state area. I've done hunting in Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And kind of from there, once Ohio back in 2004, went and passed their concealed carry license and such. I was in that first year, I went along and got my concealed carry license, which I was able to start carrying at that point, which was good. And then I can remember one of the last things I talked to the instructor about at the end of the concealed carry class was, how could I become a concealed carry instructor, because I was already hunting. I was at that time too. I was also a hunter education instructor, so I was used to getting up in front of people and describing things to it. And he went along and gave me a very long explanation that it would be, a very long time, very difficult to do it. So I kind of brushed it off until coming back around to the Boy Scouts again. I was in a meeting there, and they were looking for people to go along and get certified as NRA rifle and shotgun instructors. I raised my hand. I got certified with that, and then just kind of climbed up the stairs of the NRA training and education to where not only was I rifle and shotgun, I got pistol, I got their personal protection course, I got their home firearm safety course, refused to be a victim, all those, and then went along and I got the notification I could apply for a training counselor, and went to the course for that, became a training counselor. And for the listeners who don't know what a training counselor is, when it comes to training, that allows you to go along and train other instructors. So about 2011, 2012, I became a training counselor, which kind of gave me that itch to go and help other people start out, because my concealed carry instructor, he did a fine job teaching me about concealed carry law, but didn't really do much on encouraging me to follow through becoming an instructor. So I wanted to help out. About 2014, I became a USCCA instructor. And then shortly after that, in 2015, I became a United States Concealed Carry training counselor also, which then allowed me to start training USCCA instructors. And again, I kind of get that bug to go along and help out people. And year after year, I'd be churning out dozens of people that wanted to help other people by training them, not just in concealed carry, but rifle, shotgun, muzzleloading, all these different disciplines I was trained in. One of the companies that I kind of affiliated myself with early on was concealedcarry.com. And they went along and brought me out to SHOT Show in 2019. And while we were sitting around as a group talking, they had their own podcast going for a couple years at that point. I went along, kind of threw out the idea, I could do a podcast. And they're like, what would be the topic? It's like, I've got this real urge to go along and help instructors be the best they can be, because I know a good instructor can really help a person thrive. And I know a bad instructor can really turn people off at the same time. And that's where I kind of found my niche. And it was 3 months after 2019 in April that we went along and launched the Firearm Trainer podcast. And since then, we've done over 300 episodes. We've had, lots and lots of different guests that come on. And one of the biggest things that I've really, I think, have been successful at hitting is we try to make the topics timely. We don't necessarily go along and debate politics, different things like that. We go along and we talk about, what is good training? How has training changed, or how do you train different types of people? I mean, you've got men and women, but you've got older students, you got younger students, you have people that have military background, people that have never touched a gun before, and each one of those different groups, you've got to be very aware of that. They take a little bit different to reach them, and to see kind of how can they go along and exercise their rights compared to somebody else, who they might be going out and using it for concealed carry, or they might be using the knowledge you're giving them to go out and hunt. But everybody's got their own reason for it. And as I go along and tell them, every, red-blooded American out there has, the Second Amendment rights to it, but it's also your responsibility to understand the law. And that's, those are things that a lot of times we don't hear a lot of people talking about, that, yeah, you can carry, you can do this, you can do that, but you also have to know the law, or else the law can come down on you pretty hard when it comes to firearm-related infractions.
Yeah. Well, thanks a bunch for that background. I relate to what you had to say there in a number of ways. The first thing I want to mention is that I appreciate that you kind of, it sounds like you came to the firearms world, at least after childhood, from a hunting perspective to begin with, at least as an adult. And what I like about that is that, yeah, obviously I see on Facebook and where you post a fair amount about hunter education. But what a
Hmm.
lot of people don't know, especially people who aren't familiar with the firearms sort of culture, is that it, it can be kind of siloed into different subcultures within the firearms world, right? There's the hunters, there's the self defense folks, and then there's like the competition folks, and there may be others, but those are sort of the main ones. And there's not always a lot of overlap. But what I like about your background is that you bring a lot of sort of cross discipline to span those categories and really bring people into the fold from all those different perspectives. So I really like that about what you do with your training, but also with your podcast. One thing too is that I know you talked about having a bunch of guests, and I know some really great guests. For instance, I know you've had Ken Campbell on from Gunsight.
Hmm. Yep.
And Gunsight is like the Harvard of gun shooting schools, self defense schools. You had the attorneys on retainer folks on not too long ago. I know you had one about credit card processing fees, which is a little bit more of a niche topic, but very important
Hmm.
because right, banks have made it difficult in some circumstances for people in the firearms industry to do business. What would you say are some of the episodes that you're most proud of? Do you have any top of mind, or like maybe an early episode where you thought, man, I thought I'd never get an opportunity to talk to this person, and now I feel like maybe I'm actually getting somewhere because I got to talk to Ken Campbell or whoever it was.
Well, there's a lot of those. Lot of those kind of episodes because you know, quite honestly, being in 2019, 2020, the pandemic started right after that, and I was able to go along, connect with industry titans like Tom Givens, Asab Ayub, Ken Campbell. Different names like that to really get their insight into it because they've been there and they've done it, and that's where it's great. But also on the flip side, I've been able to dive into some topics that to the people that are not instructors may not seem real important, but you brought up credit card processing, and that's one of those to where if you're going to be an online business and take class registrations online, different things like that, you've got to have some kind of you got to take credit cards, or else you're going to have people that sign up never show up. You have those kind of issues, but also too, as I go along and talk to new instructors, one of the things I always remind them about: you're up in front of the group, you're teaching these people how to use a firearm, whether it's a beginner class or advanced class, and you probably have a window into their mind that normal people wouldn't go along and see them all the time. How do they answer your questions about self-defense, or how they would go along and put down an animal, or doing different things like that? And that gives you a great opportunity to go along, kind of guide them in the right direction, because mental health issues is one of those things where it's becoming more uh, topical these days, when people are talking about it. But at the same time, we're talking about people that go in the media, the people that go crazy and start shooting places up or do some heinous deeds. And one of the topics where I'm very, very proud of overall in the podcast is we brought a lot of mental health professionals on, talking about a lot of different subjects. And the reason I say that is because when the comes to mental health and firearms, we are horribly successful at suicide when it comes to firearm owners. And the thing comes down to it, you just had a young child born. I've gone through many different work changes, different financial challenges, different things like that. Our listeners might go along and have relationship problems or have health problems. All those are mental health stressors. And the difference between you or I, how we go along and handle it versus somebody who decides to commit suicide or decides to do some other kind of heinous act, is we kind of have a way of dealing with those. And that's where, if you've got a friend that'll just go along and say, "Hey, Alex, you seem a little bit off today. What's going on? Yeah, come on, you can tell me." And you can come up with a good plan. You don't necessarily have to go along, go see a doctor or be admitted to hospital. You just need somebody to be able to go along and talk about it and say, "Hey, man, you're just not right. Why don't we go do this?" Or instead of going out drinking tonight, let's just sit around and talk for a while to try to get your head, back on straight. One of the things I brought up in and so some of the mental health is the statistic that 22 veterans take their lives every day, and you don't hear a lot about that. But when you actually go along and think about 22 soldiers that served our country took their lives because they can't handle what they saw, because homicide, going along and seeing war and all that kind of stuff, no matter how strong you think you are, that's gonna cause some problems, and you need to be able to go along and have friends, buddies, different people like that you can go along and get in touch with when you feel you're going to dark places. And like I said, we all run into those. It's not just one of those things where it's those people that have the problems. We all can have those, but we have different ways of dealing with it based upon our family, based upon our life experiences, all those types of things, and bringing mental health a little bit more forward when it comes to firearm training might allow that firearm instructor to go along and say, hey, let's take 10 minutes and I'm going to go and I'm going to, talk to somebody on the side and kind of, you know, find out, where their head is and different things like that. Sometimes it brings up, bad memories for it with somebody who's been assaulted or somebody who's had a loved one that's been, the victim of gun violence. And sometimes it's just one of those things where people get overwhelmed with emotion because they never thought they would be in a firearm class where they're going along holding a gun, where they're going along and doing something because they've changed their mindset over the last 50 years or some long time like that. And I've had all those kind of students in my class, and I relay that on to my instructors when I teach, because if you teach long enough, you will have all those types of people and more that'll show up to your class. And you as an instructor can't just go along and say, lace up, just suck it up, get over it. It's one of those things where you really want to go along as a responsible firearm instructor and ask yourself the question, should this person really be in the class now, or would it be better go along and refer them to go see, a religious leader or a mental health professional or somebody else like that to help them get the life in straight before you go along and, start having them shoot and, give them the possibility to carry concealed, those types of questions.
Yeah, and what I like about your points with respect to mental health is that this is something that's broader than the firearms issue or the firearms training issue. This is something that
Hmm.
can help folks in just about any situation, and it's something that I think that people often overlook, or it's stigmatized, or people are ashamed if they're going through mental health issues on their own. And I know that one person that I know you've had on as a guest, Brooke Cheney, she does
Hmm.
suicide prevention Saturday, I think she calls it, and that's her focus, right? Is trying to reach more people about these issues and encouraging people to seek out help if they are having these mental health problems. And as it relates to firearms and firearms instructors, I mean, in a way, as you mentioned, you want to encourage people and help people who are firearms instructors to be better instructors.
Hmm.
And I think that in a way, firearms instructors are sort of disciples of freedom and of firearms and the right to keep and bear arms. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of times they are the first impression that somebody will get when it comes to fire, not only firearms training but the firearms industry in general. And so you want them to make a good impression on people. And I think that by at least acknowledging the mental health problem or the mental health aspect uh, that can be present in the firearms discussions, at least, I think that helps bring some humanity to the topic.
Hmm.
And let's face it, a lot of many deaths with firearms are suicides, and so this is not a problem that should be taken lightly. I think that more people need to know about these issues, and I encourage folks, obviously, to go back and listen to uh, uh, your episodes with Brooke Cheney and with others about the mental health
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
issues.
and when you're talking about suicide or suicide attempts, it's not just firearms. Firearms just happen to be a little bit more successful, but you have people that go along. We've all heard the stories about older citizens that go along and commit suicide in a garage because of their health failing. They turn the car on and just sit in the car and slowly fall asleep. That's one of those things to where it's sad to hear that because they are 70, 80 years old and that's the only way they can think, to live out their final hours, and something along those lines. When I go along, and I'm getting up there in age, and I can definitely say that one of my biggest joys in life now are my grandkids. I've seen my grandkids, of playing with them, and doing different things like that. And I would do anything I could to be there to help them, to do things like that. And I wouldn't want to go along, leave the world early just because of something on my side. I would rather go along and do everything I can to be there for the kids. And that's where going along and you know having people and start the conversation and get people aware of, ask and see what the people tell you. A lot of times people tell you before it ever gets critical. And if you can go along and have a quick conversation and help them get back on the right track, that saves society a lot of heartbreak, not to mention families and spouses and all those other ones that are left wondering, why didn't I see the signs? Why didn't I do something earlier? Those types of things, which a lot of times people don't realize that suicide leaves many more questions than they ever solve for the survivors behind them.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. One thing I want to mention, you talked about becoming a firearm training counselor through the NRA and through the USCCA. So I want to emphasize, you're not just a firearms instructor; you're an instructor to instructors, right?
Hmm.
You train the trainers. And I think that's a a huge accomplishment, or at least a significant one. And would you tell us, because it's not that difficult to become a certified instructor, whether that's through USCCA or through the NRA, but would you tell the audience a little bit about what it takes to become a training counselor?
Well, to go along, be an instructor, it takes a weekend, and you've got to be able to shoot, whether it's rifle, shotgun, muzzleloader, whatever it is. You've got a fairly simple course of fire that makes sure that you can hit the target. It's not bullseye kind of targeting, but that's how you become an instructor. To go along and become a training counselor, what they want you to do is be able to go along, demonstrate that you've been teaching students on a regular basis. Normally, it's about 50 students within a 2-year period of time. And from the NRA standpoint, you've got to have at least 4 firearm disciplines underneath your belt. So that's where pistol, rifle, shotgun, muzzle loading, those would be 4 disciplines that I started off with. I was able to go along and get my training counselor with. And then from there, you can take your experience of teaching all those students and start training instructors on how to put those courses on effectively. And the one thing about it is, I said it takes about 2 days in order to get a instructor certification. That's just for the instructor certification. A lot of what my podcast focuses on is all the ancillary things. We talk about mental health, credit card process, social media, dealing with the media, as far as getting things published, going along and knowing how to go along, deal with, different groups and reach out to minorities, all these different areas where you could go along and say, well, it could, really make sense. Well, but how would you go along and reach out to the Jewish community if you're not in the Jewish community? And that's where I found the Pew Pew Jew, an influencer, uh, and had him come on to talk about it, because a lot of firearm instructors that I know very few that are Jewish. But at the same time, when you started having issues like what happened over in Israel, a year and a half ago, in Gaza, you had a lot of Jewish people that were worried about it. And I said, okay, how would I approach that community and sound like somebody that could help them versus just somebody who, hey, I want to make a quick buck off you. And that's where I think a lot of firearm instructors, they've got a good heart to where it's like, hey, if I've got to discount the class to get the information out there for people, I'm willing to do that. Or, if a person comes to me and they're in a domestic violence situation, I will help them first, and then we'll figure out payment later. All those types of things I've heard instructors do, and that's where I tackle a lot of those kind of topics, because if I'm asking the question in my own mind, I'm sure there's other instructors that are sitting there saying, oh, wow, how could I do this? How could I help these people? Because again, as an instructor, you put in a lot of time to prepare for your classes, get yourself trained. And even though you might be making some money during a concealed carry class, nobody is, becoming a millionaire. teaching concealed carry, period. It's just not the way it works.
Right. I saw Greg Ellifritz on that point posted recently. He said basically you're not going to make a living as a firearms instructor unless you've already got a pension or retirement that you're drawing. Then you can do it as supplemental income, but it's going to be difficult to make it as a full time firearms instructor as your main income source.
Yeah,
But
there are very, very few that can say they don't have a pension and they're actually making it. Because
right,
Tom Givens, Masada Ayub, even Greg, they're all retired law enforcement. Very
right.
knowledgeable, very good resources, but they've also got that extra income coming in. That if they've got a month that's slower or pandemic that happens where they can't teach or nobody's signing up for courses, they've still got some income coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And back to your point too about the focus of your podcast. I mean, the NRA, whether you're becoming an instructor or a training counselor, they've got their curriculum for those folks to become instructors. The same with USCCA, and it's a good curriculum, but it doesn't
Hmm.
touch on things like credit card processing fees, like first aid, trauma first aid or range medical issues. It doesn't talk about things related to post-defense support groups like
Hmm.
ACLDN or attorneys on retainer. It doesn't talk about these sorts of topics that you dive into on the podcast, which really augment what you learn through the NRA
Hmm.
instructor curriculum or the USCCA instructor curriculum. And while we're talking about that, I'm going to put up your podcast page here on the screen for those watching the podcast by video. The first screen here is your homepage,
Hmm.
firearmtrainerpodcast.com, and the podcast is there along with the show notes. If you go to recent episodes, you can see there the most recent one was the credit card processing episode, and you've got the show notes there with some
Hmm.
useful links and contact information related to the guest. So you do a great job. I love what you do with the website, compiling resources for firearms instructors as well. Um, this is the Apple Podcast page, and you can see here sort of the range of topics. You talked about the status of the NRA and revolvers and
Hmm.
holsters and all sort of leggings, all sorts of things that are not that you can get into a lot more detail in your podcast than you ever could in an instructor development course. Uh,
Right.
yeah, so I really love that about your show, and these are not just topics for instructors, right? These are topics that are valuable for just everyday gun owners too, right? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, one of the things where you were going back talking about those things that I always, remind people about. I've been doing the podcast now going on 6 years. Been a concealed carry holder now for over 20 years. And when I went through a concealed carry class back in 2004, double action, single action, semi-automatics were the way to go. The SIGs and different things like that. The striker fires like the Glocks that were around then were called tactical Tupperware because they were all plastic. They just were not viewed quite as positively as getting a good SIG 226, SIG 229, things along those lines. And I bring those things up for people to realize because having a double action, single action, semi-automatic sounds like, okay, it's semi-automatic, I pull the trigger, goes bang, but it's a different gun than a striker fired. It's a different gun than a revolver. Even when you go along and say, okay, Glock, they've got the same pretty much design, grip angle, and everything from back in 1985 when Gaston Glock introduced it. They're right, except for what do we have now? We've got the single stack Glocks. We've got the red dot Glocks. We've got all these different ones are there. And I keep going along trying to make sure instructors realize that you get certified, but now you got to keep up with what the industry's changes because, who hasn't seen a red dot on a pistol? But how many people have seen a revolver, in one of their classes? And a lot of people, and I can tell you, I've taught many firearm instructor classes to law enforcement because they need to be NRA certified in order to teach their internal classes too. And one of the things that's always interesting is they know how to run their Glocks, their Smith and Wesson M&Ps very well, but a lot of them don't know how to run a revolver. And that's one of those things to where at some point in your concealed carry class, you're going to have somebody show up with a revolver because you know, that's what they got at the house, or that's what they decided they want to carry. And different guns for different people, different sizes, all those types of things. And as an instructor, you could be ready to be able to help the person who is, 70 years old, who doesn't have the grip strength of a 20-year-old to pull the trigger on a gun. At the same time, you've got to go along and explain to them the pros and cons behind carrying a Glock 17 versus carrying a J-frame Smith & Wesson revolver in their pocket. And those are all things where none of those instructor courses really dive into those types of things. And that's where you've got to do pretty much your own self-study or come to some kind of knowledgeable source to be able to go along and help explain those types of things, because which one's better, a J-frame revolver or a Glock 17? And I would say both. It all depends on how you're going to apply it, because a J-frame, nice and small, compact, 5 rounds. But you go along and look at the Glock 17, you've got 17 rounds, but you also can't fire it from a pocket or something along those lines without it malfunctioning. And that's where the J frame shines at, is you could be in your pocket and pull the trigger, and even though you'll shoot a hole in your coat, your pants, wherever, whatever pockets it's in, it still will fire the next round off when you pull the trigger. And that's, again, understanding the pros and cons behind it. Red dots are all the rage, but what happens when the battery goes out? What happens when you've got snow or ice or they get cracked? Do your students know what to do? Do you know how to tell them what they can do to stay in the fight in those kind of situations? And those are all various skills that, or skills slash knowledge that you want to have as an instructor, because all those things are going to be coming at you the first time that you go and schedule your first public course. People
Yeah.
are going to say, well, what do I do here? How's this? Which one's better? A 38 or 9mm? I heard them say 40 caliber, is what all the police carry, or the 45 is the won 2 world wars. Nobody can argue with that. And you've got to be able, again, understand the pros and cons between carrying a bigger, heavier round versus a smaller, lighter round in your guns.
Yeah. Yeah. And not only is there a diversity of equipment, right? Different types of handguns, as you mentioned, but there's also a diversity of learning styles too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people learn visually. Some people you can give them a picture. Some people you have to demonstrate on the range. Some people you can discuss, verbally. And those are all things that, as an instructor, you have to learn to adapt to on the fly, not just the equipment, but the person
Yeah.
as well. So
You
those are
take
all
your
things.
20 something years old, they've been glued to their, smartphones since they were born pretty much.
Mhm.
Um, but you go along and look at somebody who's 70 years old doing something, on a phone, may be a little foreign to them. They might be a little bit more tactile to where they want to have it in their hands and do it a few times. And that's where if you've got those two different students in your class, you've got to be able to say, okay, how do I reach them both? How do I go along and keep them interested in the class and make it relevant to what they're doing? Because the 70-year-old might be coming to you because they're afraid the neighborhood that they own their house in, they're going to retire, or they're retired to, neighborhood's going down, so they want something for protection. The 20-something-year-old might be going along saying, I just got married, I got a kid, and now I feel more responsible that I got to be able to defend them in case, something does happen. And that's where, as an instructor, you've got to be able to go along, guide them, and, give them the knowledge so they can be a responsibly armed citizen.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have to be sensitive to it. I think that there's a tendency among some instructors to just sort of assume that people are going to come to their class with a particular political bias too. And I think you have to be sensitive to that, because I know our family, I'm an instructor with both of my parents and my brother. We have plenty of people who would be considered on the progressive left who, in recent years, especially with the rioting that we've seen in recent years, who have decided maybe it is a good idea to take up arms in self-defense, or to learn how to use a firearm in self-defense, because I might need that someday, because I'm not as confident as I used to be that that the police will be able to be there for me on a moment's notice, no
Mm-hmm.
matter how hard they try. So I think that it's especially useful for instructors to be cognizant that you may have a politically diverse class show up as well.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
here's a really interesting episode I did, and I go along and acknowledge it was the most uncomfortable episode I had ever done, even to today, and it was about 3 years ago. It was a diversity panel, and the thing about it is, I had Tony Simon. He's a big black dude for it. I had Beth, who was a openly gay lesbian lady. Had I had Chris Chung from out in California, who is again gay shooter out in California, and missing the other one. But we went along and talked about what it was like for them to get into the shooting sports and be able to go along and feel welcomed and embraced and everything. And there are some interesting stories there. And the biggest thing I got to say, why I call it my most uncomfortable episode, is because I knew all these people. I, respected them, as shooters and such. We didn't all have the same political views, but all I could think about in my mind when I was scheduling this is, what are they going to do if I ask the wrong question? If they go along, well, you've offended me. And what they all told me was, don't worry about offending us. I mean, we know you're a good guy. If you say something wrong, we're going to say, Rob, you don't understand that. Let me explain it to you. And that's where we had a really good conversation on the podcast. And after, I think it was over an hour, uh, we all were all laughing and having fun. And to this day, when I see Tony Simon or Beth or Gina, those, we say hi, we have fun and do things, and it's all about the 2A. We don't go along necessarily compare, what our different views are on politics, because we know each other, from the firearm standpoint, and the politics is, a very small part of it.
Yeah. Here's something we agree on and something that we can be passionate about promoting. Let's focus on that as a common endeavor, right? A common goal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great perspective to take. I, it's interesting. I went to Gun Rights Policy Conference for the first time last year, and there's a significant. It was in Phoenix, or not? Okay, not in 2024. In 2023, it was in Phoenix, and which is not far from Southern California. And so, as you might imagine, there were a number of groups who might not show up if it were, in the Midwest, right? In terms of diversity. And I loved it. The conversation was respectful. People, like you say, they knew each other. So there was that personal relationship there where you could talk freely and exchange ideas. Unlike what you see on the internet so many times, people who don't know each other engage in this divisive conversation because they haven't developed that personal relationship first, that trust between each other. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind, that if you want to have some rapport with somebody, if you want somebody to listen to your ideas, they have to trust you first, and they have to have some confidence that what you're saying is from a perspective of helpfulness and consideration for them. So I love that. I hadn't listened to that episode that you mentioned. I'll have to go back and look for that.
Yeah. Well, here's another one that's interesting. I was at a gun conference, the Concealed Carry Guarding Conference a couple years ago, and met one of the board members for the Liberal Gun Owners of California. Now, think about it. We're at a gun conference where he's running, he's shooting, he's doing all the stuff like I'm shooting, but he's with the Liberal Gun Owners. And it's like, oh, this will be very interesting. And I had him on as a guest because, again, giving some exposure so the firearm owners / instructors, kind of see the other side, not so much as being completely 180 degrees opposed to what we're thinking. It's just they've got different views on different things, and that's where once you go and appreciate that and realize where they're coming from, that they're coming from the heart, you're coming from the heart, you can have a lot better conversations than just going along and sticking a label on them and say, well, that's those guys. They don't believe we should do this, don't believe that. Well, actually, I do believe that we should be able to do that. It's just that they can't get their, they've got other priorities when it comes politically, and then go along and try to, like remove, the suppressors from the NFA. That's my big goal for 2025 is try to get the suppressors off the NFA.
I would love to see that. I know that one of the reform candidates running for the NRA. I know you had John Richardson on recently, and that episode will be coming out soon.
Hmm.
John Richardson, of course, is the guy behind the Only Guns and Money blog. I had an episode with him recently, and you'll be releasing one soon as well. He's running as a reform candidate for the NRA, but one of the other reform candidates, Knox Williams, is with I think it's called the American Suppressor Association, and one of their big uh, projects or one of their goals is to get the Hearing Protection Act, or what was referred to as the Hearing Protection Act, which is the removal of suppressors from the National Firearms Act, accomplished. I'm like you. I'm optimistic. I hope that gets accomplished because there is no reason that suppressors should be a regulated arm under the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Well, I would say anybody who's just like, you can't do that, people be getting shot all over the place. And it's like, you really
Yeah.
need to go to the range and shoot the gun without a suppressor on it, and then shoot the gun with a suppressor on it. They're not silent like, what James Bonds makes it sound like. But at the same time, you can still hear them. But you've also got to realize that criminals, bad guys, they can, they're going to use whatever, opportunity, they have at hand for it. In the US, it happens to be a lot of firearms, but when you go over to Asia, there's a lot of, knife attacks and such, because knives are very common over there. And that's where people need to, kind of know how to slice and dice numbers a little bit to see, how to go along and look at them, because U.S. has one of the lowest violent crime rates compared to industrialized nations. Not firearm crime. I'm talking just violent crime overall. When you go along, take baseball bats and knives and cars and add them all together, U.S. is lower than England and other places like that have firearms outlawed. So figure out how that works out.
I don't want to dwell on this
Yeah.
too much because no, I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm going to mention just a few more points there. One of the things that I always like to point out when I have an opportunity, and thanks, Rob, you gave me the opportunity to talk about John Lott from the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's got some
Hmm.
of the best information out there on this topic. You and I can talk about various figures here and there, but he just has a command of
Yeah.
all of the information that I'll never be able to achieve. So
Yeah, and John's been on the podcast before, and every time I see him at a conference, he's a great person just to chat with for a little bit, because he really kind of understands. And as I go along and say, statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. That quote, because you realize that saying a cup is half full or half empty means the same thing, but you can also go along and skew that however way you want to. And John Lott is that person who understands the math behind it and realizes that if you go along and measure it this way, you get one answer, but if you measure it a different way, you get a different answer. And it can really, kind of point out that, guns aren't the problem in America the way the media or the anti-gun people really try to make them out to be. It's more along lines of, we've got problems in our criminal justice system more so than we have, with firearm ownership.
Yeah. And I think one of the, or I'll say two of the more compelling points that he makes, and he has great information. I'll try to link to the podcast that you did with him
Hmm.
as well as his website. Uh, but he points out, number one, that there is no example where a country has instituted some form of gun control and the homicide rate has gone down, which is what we care about, right? We care about the killing of another human being by a human being, and the so whether it's with knives, with vehicles driven through a crowd, with guns, no matter what it is, what we care about is stopping humans killing other humans,
Hmm.
and not just monomaniacally focusing on killings with guns. And what he's pointed out is that there has never been a country that has instituted gun control that had a drop in their homicide rate. So that should give people some, at least question their assumption that we can just ban guns and magically the homicide rate will fall.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
The other is that he points out this distinction between the United States and the United Kingdom in burglaries. I think they're called hot burglaries, where it's a burglary that's committed while the homeowner is present in the home.
Hmm.
And the rate of hot burglaries in the United Kingdom is some significant degree. It's like 50 or 60% higher than what it is in the United States, because the burglar in the United Kingdom knows that the homeowner is not likely to be armed, especially not with a firearm. So
Hmm.
I think those are pretty compelling pieces of information that should give people pause when they're advocating for more gun control. But he's full of information like
Yeah, when it
that.
comes to magazine bans, assault weapons, all these different kinds of things, he goes along and breaks it down that, you've got a higher chance of going along and getting killed by somebody with a baseball bat than with somebody with a AR-15,
Yeah,
AKA assault weapon, or with a rifle. And when you hear something like that, it's like, wow, it doesn't sound like that when you listen to the media. And
yeah,
that's where, again, trying to be a John's a voice of reason. I try to, I stay away from the politics as much as I can within the podcast, because I also want to be, seen as a voice of reason. Because as soon as you start dipping your toe into politics, you're going to alienate part of your audience either way. And my big drive has been education of the instructors so that they can go along and help gun owners be more responsible and know what their rights are, as well as how to properly go along and handle, store, use a firearm.
And speaking of your focus on education, you mentioned that you started the podcast. You sort of got the idea, or mentioned the idea on in your discussion with concealedcarry.com, and obviously started, I think, with the goal of education. How has the podcast changed? How has it evolved over the years, if it has?
Uh, I think it's kind of stayed true to the mission of educating things. I think in the first year, it was really easy to come up with, 52 topics. I had people that were like, wow, it'd be great to talk to this person, great to talk to that person about. And then as you start looking and looking who's there, I've got Tom Gibbons and Masada Oop on. Okay. Having them on again, for the same topic isn't really that interesting. So then I had to start, okay, what areas within teaching are still open? And that's where you go along and you start looking and say, okay, we got Ken Campbell and Gunsight, because everybody hears about Gunsight, but does anybody outside of the hardcore 2A people really know what Gunsight is for it? Do people know about, how to go along and engage their local police department to help them training? Because in a lot of cases, and I've done this before, to where, yes, police wear a badge and they have a gun every day, but that doesn't mean that they are quote unquote highly trained in firearms. And
Yeah.
those are all topics where, I go along and think about it. It's like, I'd like to know something more about it. So I look for somebody in the industry who can educate me as the host, but then also to the audience about, what do you need to know in order to engage with, with a police department. And one of the things I learned early on is I got certified with the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearm Instructors, ILEFI, and great training. And the one thing that I walked away from wasn't a increased degree of firearm knowledge, because I already had, several dozen classes underneath my belt. It was an increased knowledge about the education needs for police officers, about going along and understanding Supreme Court rulings, different things like that, which their firearm training went in completely different direction than like a USCCA or NRA, because they were talking about your department has to get trained in order for it to comply with these Supreme Court rulings. Your department has to go along and know how to do this to comply with these Supreme Court rulings. And those are all things that I walked away from like, wow, law enforcement training is a little bit more involved than just going along and teach them how to pull the trigger.
Yeah. One thing I want to ask you about, I want to make sure that we cover before the end of the podcast is, partly because I'm curious, but I'm sure the listeners would be interested in hearing as well. Most of us have mentors or people we look up to, or people who sort of helped us along the way. For me, just from my personal experience, obviously my father had a great deal of impact on me, especially in lots of ways, but especially so with firearms training and development as an instructor. But also, I kind of grew up, or as a new instructor, learned a lot from listening to Tom Gresham and Gun Talk, and I heard about uh, Tiger McKee from that, and we spent a great deal of time training with Tiger McKee down at Shoot Right Firearms Academy in Alabama, and then of course Masad Ayub and his Mag 40 class and Deadly Force instructor class, and others. Uh, do you have any? Who are some of your biggest influences? I guess is my question.
Well, I would go along and say probably one of the biggest influences as a NRA training counselor called John Farquhar, aka Mad Duck in Southern Ohio, where I took quite a bit of NRA training from, and I've had him on the podcast. I got to respect him that much. He was, one of the first guests I had on, but also, he helped me a lot along the way. Did go along and kind of build up, what should I be training in? He had a lot of connections with people in the industry, and that's always helpful for somebody to say, this is really where you need to go along and get training for. This guy, you could take a training from him, but I got more out of going to this class, which, as firearm trainers, you've always got a limited budget, so you're always trying to weigh, okay, do I spend, a weekend doing this, or do I spend a week doing that? This week is SHOT Show, and unfortunately, I had to put that on the back burner because of some vacation time I took off recently, and it was just it's a trade off in life. But John's definitely been a big influence, and then when it comes to podcasting and in kind of the business side of things, there's Jacob Paulson over on. He's the present owner of concealcarry.com, and appreciate his support in getting the podcast started. And then also, many times we've talked about, where the podcast is going, what we can do, doing things, because one of the things that I'm probably most proud about when it comes to the podcast is it's a niche podcast. I will never be, going along threatening Joe Rogan as far as the top podcast out there, but I'm in the top 2% of podcasts worldwide for dedicated listeners, being around. And when you're talking, I think there's over 10 million podcasts currently that are being tracked, and I'm in the top 2%. I mean, there's a lot of us up there, but to be in 2% worldwide of podcasts, that's a heck of an accomplishment for such a niche subject as firearm training, because it's not going to appeal to people over in Asia or in Europe as much as it's going to appeal to people in the U.S. Now, we do have some people that do listen over in foreign countries, but they're, 1, 2, 3 people, not, it's thousands of people firearm instructors that we've got in the United States.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome, and I know that's a testament to your consistency, all the hard work. There's a lot more work, I know, behind the scenes, putting together a podcast and lining up the guests and
Mm-hmm.
putting out episodes reliably and consistently. And I know that's undoubtedly a huge part of your success, in addition to the great information that you put out with respect to the firearms training world and the firearms industry in general. Um, what do you have any? I guess do you have any big plans for the future of the podcast? Any changes planned, or I know you've got over 300 episodes you said out now.
Mm-hmm.
Any big changes that you see coming in the future, or you just going to keep plugging away like you have been?
I think we're going to keep plugging away. But then
Yeah,
again, the one thing that I'm, very willing to do, that if something, takes a right turn, say like, we were talking about the suppressors coming off the NFA. Well, that would be a really big topic to go along and start talking to instructors about how do you instruct people with
yeah,
suppressors on, or something along those lines, because that's going to be very relevant. They go along and say, okay, February 1st, no more tax stamp, and you can go along and buy a suppressor just like you buy a firearm. I bet you sales of suppressors for the next year would probably be through the roof. And we would be seeing them in classes, or people be asking, what do you need to do in order to put a suppressor on your firearm, and getting people to realize you need threaded barrels and different things like that. If mental health becomes bigger, potentially with that, you were talking about John Richardson being on the show about being an NRA reform candidate. I can see it being a topic where we probably come back a couple times, revisit this year, because as I go along and say, I started out with the NRA. But it's not because I'm with the NRA. I've been an NRA member since mid '90s. It's that I think we need the NRA to be there, to be the grill in the room who can go along and get people from across all 50 states to call their congressmen to complain, not to pass something or to pass something for it. There's a lot of other good organizations out there. The Second Amendment Foundation, FPC, GOA, all those do great work when it comes to litigation and legislation. But when you talk about, striking fear into a politician's heart, when you go along and say, I'm from the NRA, they go along and realize just how much clout that those three letters have. And I think, they've been the voice for firearm owners, and the biggest push that I hope that they will see with the reform candidates is, instead of being going alone all the time, that they'll work with like GOA and FPC uh, to go and be a lot more effective in promoting things. Because if you can go along and say, I'm just not representing 3 million gun owners as the NRA, but I'm representing 5 or 6 million, and we're going to take you to court tomorrow if this gets passed, and being able to follow through on those types of things to preserve our civil rights and our freedom and such. Because as much as people complain about having firearms and the crime that comes with it, homicides, all those negative things with firearms, it's also the one thing to where, again, I'll go back to John Lott's numbers. Millions of people defend themselves successfully every year with a firearm. Now, compare those two numbers and say, do you want people who can't defend themselves becoming victims, or do you want to go along and have people, be able to defend themselves and some additional homicides or so, along those lines? And that's where, like anything in life, it's a balancing act. But I would rather have the ability to defend myself than to go along depend on a police officer to come there, or the kindness of the criminal not to go along and injure me or my family.
So, last question before we wrap up, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to provide any concluding thoughts that you have as well. What's one of the top resources that you look to learn? Obviously, you're a significant resource to educate others. What do you look to educate yourself? I know I look to many, but what's one or maybe a few of the top resources that you look to?
For a lot of guns stuff, I go to the manufacturers' websites to go along and look and see. I also go along and look and watch, YouTube videos, because there's a lot of good YouTube ones out there that will help you get good insight to how things go. And I'll 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 tell you one that I did this week, googling with all the announcements coming uh, out of SHOT Show. I saw that Smith and Wesson was going along, and they came out with no lock revolvers. And I thought to myself, what in the heck are they talking about? No lock revolvers. I just had never in any recent heard anything talked about, no lock revolvers. Well, I finally realized after I Googled it that the no lock is a carryover from the mid '90s, when they used to go along and sell revolvers with little locks on them that you could go lock the action. They don't prevent your finger being on the trigger, but they do prevent the gun from being pulling the trigger and it going off. And I, quite honestly, never had anybody come to any class with one of those. Have never owned one myself, and I had to go out and Google and find some resources for that. And that was one of those things to where the internet's good, but I always go along and tell people you have to have a good BS meter, because there are some channels that are not that good, and that's where hopefully I'm watching the right ones and have the right BS meter, so I can pass on the right information to other people for it. And one of the things I'll give you a compliment to, Alex, is I listen to the Forge of Freedom, because you bring up a lot of great resources that I hadn't ran across before, a lot of good topics for it. And I like those that challenge my thinking about, okay, why did I think this way, or why did I think that way? Because I see myself as very much of a freedom loving type of person, but sometimes freedom becomes complacent, and you forget that your freedom might be infringing upon somebody else's. And that's where challenging people, the whole idea of the justice reform and the going along and profiting from imprisoning or having commercial prisons and the whole war on drugs, those type of topics that you've tackled have really gone along, and you get start thinking about it. And again, that's one thing I want to do my entire life is, have what I'm thinking kind of challenge and say, okay, how would this work today, compared to what it was 50, 100, 200 years ago when our founding fathers went along and, created our experiment in democracy.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that comment, that a compliment. It means a lot to me. That's my podcast. Obviously, is not as focused as yours is, but I do hope to give people some food for thought, and if not to change their mind, at least get them to think about these issues. And of course, I care deeply about firearms. I talk about firearms a lot. I think it's an essential component to freedom. But I think that freedom encompasses lots of other things as well, which I care about a lot. So thanks a bunch for that compliment. Rob, any concluding thoughts that you have, and also where are the best places to find your work? I mentioned the Firearm Trainer podcast website. Are there other places that folks can find your more about your
We've, we-
training or your work?
we've got the website. We've got we're on Spotify. We're on Apple, Google Podcast, all the main iHeart iHeart podcasts. Kind of hard to say that all together, but all the favorite podcast channels for it. So if you're looking for things for it, if you're looking for training from me specifically, I've got a training company in southwestern Ohio called American Defense Training, and that's where I promote my classes and have those listed there. If you are interested, reach out to me, and we can see what's going on. I do, again, anything from your basic beginning pistol class all the way up to advanced kind of run and shoot and force on force kind of classes, which, as I go along and tell people, it's great that you can shoot, but how many times have you had to make a decision while you've been in a confrontation with a gun pointed at you? And we use non-lethal airsoft guns to do this, but it really gets your blood pumping when you're thinking, okay, do I shoot? Don't I shoot? At what point do you? Because no matter what your reaction is to it, it's not right or wrong, but we go along and ask, okay, now justify that. Why would you go along and take this action versus another? And that's where, again, trying to prepare people to think about it from a legal standpoint, because if you can't justify it, you're not going to win in court, is the bottom line it comes to it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned those topics because the sort of the force on force or the situational application of firearms handling and marksmanship, as well as the decision making, not only the practical decision making but the legal decision making in a life or death situation is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, highly underappreciated in the firearms training world, or at least by people who are consumers of firearms training. So
Well,
I'm
and the
glad you
one thing
brought that up.
I tell instructors not to be surprised about this is about 85%, 85% of what people think they know about firearms comes from Hollywood video politicians.
Yeah.
And we can probably all go along and say that's probably the wrong place for it, because what do we see on the cop dramas, things like that? You get shot, you get thrown backwards, right? You go along and you shoot, and you never run out of bullets, all these types of things. And that's where take some class, get some reality, and you realize that you need to be prepared for it, because whatever you think might go down during a confrontation, it's not going to go down that way. So you got to have a whole lot of reference points to be able to say, okay, if I got the opportunity to run, I'm going to run, or I got to duck behind a car. But what part of the car? How am I going to shoot if I can only see his foot, or something along those lines, and be able to have that knowledge in the background to say, okay, what can I legally do, and what can I do responsibly for it in a confrontation.
Well, Rob, I really appreciate you coming along for the podcast. I enjoyed our discussion. I hope our listeners did as well. Of course, I'll link to the podcast, firearmtrainerpodcast.com, and I'll link to your training website as well as,
Mm-hmm.
and I try to remember the episodes that we mentioned with respect to like Brooke Cheney and the mental health, and John Lott, and some others as well. So
Mm-hmm.
people can get a good sampling of the episodes you've done.
Yeah, I appreciate it. One of the most humbling things I got to say about the podcast is I've had a few people see me at conferences and thank me for the topics. And as I'm talking to them and I ask them, okay, what classes do you teach? Where do you teach at? They tell me, I don't. I'm just a concealed carry holder.
Yeah.
So they've actually bled over. And the topics that I put out there for instructors, there's even some concealed carry holders or firearm owners that go along, listen to them because they bleed over, outside just the pure instructor kind of topics.
Yeah, and I can second that. I think that many of your episodes are applicable to people who are not instructors, and oftentimes applicable outside of the firearms context in general, and maybe not directly, but indirectly. So I
Hmm.
really appreciate your episodes for that, and your focus on firearms, but just the quality of the content that you put out in general. So
Oh, thank
Rob,
you.
Rob, thanks again for coming along. And everybody, thanks for listening. Of course, you can always find the episodes on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.